record now, and then we will go ahead and get started. So Patty, I am going to turn it over to you and share your outline for everybody. Oh, maybe.
Well, I'll just get started. First off, can everybody hear me? I'm seeing things flash and I'm talking, but I don't know if anybody's listening.
Yes. Can you hear me, Patty? I can hear you.
I can hear you.
I can hear Sarah. And
Okay.
so, okay. And I just got a message from Michelle that she can hear me. So,
I can hear you.
All right, perfect. I did up this outline. It's down. I got it down to five pages. It was originally like 12 pages when I started this morning, but Sarah said she's going to limit me to half an hour, but I could talk about forages pretty much all day, and I probably have. As Sarah introduced me, I'm Patty Johnson, and I live in Orange, Virginia, which I'm guessing it's Central Virginia. It's just north of Charlottesville. And my husband, Scott, and I, we just have a plain cow-calf operation. We run, right now we have probably about 40 cows, spring and fall herd, because we love calving seasons so much. We do it twice a year. We have had as many as, we've had over 100 cows at one point on 500 owned and leased acres. And so that was kind of a big experience. And then for probably about 10 years, we direct marketed grass-fed beef. So we have a pretty wide, just kind of a, we've been at it for a while. We've made a lot of mistakes and for what it's worth. And I am a past president of the Virginia Forage and Grassland Council, and I'm active with the American Forage and Grassland Council. So I have a pretty deep background in forage and forage production. And so I'm just going to kind of start out with what is forage. And there's probably like a million different definitions, but I just basically like to think of it as plants that animals can turn into either milk, meat, and I say movement because here in Virginia, we have a lot of horses. We have race horses, we have draft horses, and we most of the time people say fiber. We do produce fiber here in Virginia, and I don't mean to demean or trivialize fiber production, but forage production largely in Virginia is about horses, and we don't want to forget about that. And there is a tendency to set the horse market kind of aside when we're talking forages, but so that's just kind of my thing. And it also includes browse. So with browse, we're going to include small ruminants. Anybody who has cattle, most of the time we kind of realize that our cattle do better when they have access to trees. Cattle like to eat oak. There's a lot of tree species that cattle will eat. So I like to include browse in there as well. So forages obviously grow in some kind of grassland, and their grasslands have value to us beyond just livestock feed. I think most of us would agree that forages are the ideal way to raise and feed livestock. But in addition to feed, it provides cover and camouflage. If you've ever seen baby calves, baby deer, they'll lay down in the grass. It's important for them to hide. It also provides shelter. In the winter, calves will lay on top of grass. They like to lay on hay to insulate themselves from the ground, from the cold of the ground. There's the environmental benefits of grasslands and forages. Erosion control, we're seeing it right now. The debates are just all over the place in the West, in California, Oregon, Washington, with the wildfires out there. How can livestock grazing, maybe mitigate some of the impacts of those fires? How can we utilize some of that plant material to keep it from becoming fuel to hopefully, you know, benefit everyone? So forage has a place in fire control. It's wildlife habitat, particularly here in Virginia, game birds. We're seeing there's fewer quail because our forage species have changed, and the ones that we have now are not as conducive to some of these game birds. And there's the social benefits of forage and grasslands. We just, as humans, I think, are just drawn to the beauty of a grassland. They're just very compelling. If you're looking at grass growing, it looks like waves on the ocean. There's a whole lot of there's a deep meaning kind of in there with the forages. And then a lot of us rely on forages for our livelihoods. So it's more than just feeding animals. And a huge part of the world is grasslands. I've included a couple references in here about how much of the world is grassland and how much of Virginia is grassland. It's a pretty significant area on the map. And this is where this upcoming thing is kind of where we get lost. Since the dawn of humanity, grasslands have been managed. We have always, as a species, and probably even human species before us, used fire to manage grasslands. They learned to divert animal movement. There's a lot of records that indicate that indigenous peoples and even what we would call prehistoric peoples used fire to manage grasslands. And so we've always done it as a species. We kind of forget about that, and we can't use those tools. A lot of times we think our grasslands will manage themselves if we just leave them alone, that they'll just, you know, kind of do their thing, but they don't. So with the fact that we no longer have fires or migratory ruminants are the other thing that had a huge part in shaping our native grasslands. I'm speaking mostly here in the United States, but throughout the world, those migratory ruminants and fire really shaped grasslands, kept some of these invasives, what we would call invasives, but trees and things like that, kept them out of the grasslands. And we don't have that anymore. So what do our grasslands in the United States look like? There are very few native grasslands left. If you are in Virginia, I don't think I've ever seen a native grassland. I guess I probably have, maybe driving across parts of the Midwest, but to my knowledge, I've never seen a native grassland. Every bit of green that you see in Virginia, pretty much every bit of green that you see is a grass that was imported at some point, typically during the 1800s. All these species of grasses were imported, and we call them tame grasses or adapted grasses, but they're all introduced species. So what you see driving down the road, in your yard, in your pastures, everywhere, those are almost all introduced species. So there are the few native warm seasons that are planted. There are government programs to try to help reestablish them. If you do any work with any wildlife groups, game bird groups and stuff like that, they're big proponents of these native warm season perennials. When Europeans came to the United States, they basically didn't manage those grasses well. And between the poor management, namely fire suppression of those native grasslands that introduced species of other grasses, their native warm season perennials just, they lost the battle. And so what we have now mostly are cool season perennials. The predominant one you see around here is Kentucky 31. It's a tall fescue. I listed some other cool season perennials. These are usually the ones that you'll see in your pastures. Most of your pastures, if you don't have an improved pasture, if you haven't made an active effort to establish grasses in your pasture, if they're the grasses are just naturally occurring there, it's almost certainly Kentucky 31. We do grow here some legumes. A lot of pastures have clover. I was just walking on some of our pastures today and saw that we have quite a bit of clover coming on. Another thing that a lot of producers will grow are cool season annuals. These are some of them are grasses, some of them are small grains, but we plant those in the fall. You'll see some of them being planted right about now. Small grains that will sometimes they're harvested for the grain, sometimes they're chopped as silage, and sometimes they're just burned down. So there's quite a few cool season annuals that we grow around here. On our farm, excuse me a second, we grow a lot of I shouldn't say a lot of summer annuals. We always put out probably about a third of our pastures on summer annuals. These are grasses that grow robustly in the summer. Kentucky 31 grows in the spring and fall, and it goes dormant in the summer. So in order to have something to feed our livestock during the summer, we do rely on Johnson grass. Excuse me again. Which is kind of what we call a noxious. A lot of people call it a noxious weed, but cattle like Johnson grass. But we also plant summer annuals. Corn and sorghum are ones that that you see a lot of. Corn, I mean, we're used to ear corn, but there are grazing species of corn. There's grazing species of soybeans. So there are a lot of plants that we grow here in Virginia to make sure we can feed our livestock during the summer, especially if you have a rotational grazing system where you're trying to feed those animals off of your pastures year round. Recently, a lot of people have been planting brassicas, turnips, and radishes. We've never planted any. A lot of people are planting them. They're what we like to call nitrogen scavengers because they have a really deep root system. When you're planting some of these other types of grasses, they have a fairly shallow root system, but these brassicas can go down deep into the soil, and they can bring up some of that nitrogen and help get some of that nitrogen cycle going, bring it closer to the surface so your other plants can benefit from that. We also feed a lot of crop residues. Feeding crop residue isn't quite as common as it used to be. When I was a kid, everybody would fence in their cornfields and run hogs on their cornfields because the combines weren't as good and everybody still had hogs at home. So, and some people still run cows on crop residue, but that's our combines and our harvesting equipment have gotten pretty good. So there's not quite the benefit to grazing crop residue. And what most of us feed in the winter, and if you have horses, you're feeding some kind of a stored forage. It's either mechanically harvested. So hay, what we do on our farm a lot is we call it baleage or haylage. It is wet hay and it's wrapped in plastic. If you ever see those, either they look like giant marshmallows or those big long white tubes of bales of hay. That's ensiled hay. That's just normally just some kind of a grass hay. When we use that plastic, we can put that hay up wetter. It ferments. It can't be fed to horses, but it works really well for cows. And then silage. If you're near a dairy, silage is typically corn, chopped corn, but not always. It can be other things. And if we're not relying on stored forage, we can mechanically harvested forage, because if it's mechanically harvested, it almost always has to be mechanically fed. What a lot of producers do here in Virginia, if you have a rotational grazing system in particular, is stockpile forage. We call it standing hay. Right about now, typically in August, but we do ours in September. We'll pull the cows off the fields, we'll mow the fields and let that grass come on. Kentucky 31 stockpiles really well, and it'll start, it's starting its fall growing spurt now. It goes dormant in the summer. And so when the temperature starts to drop, that's Kentucky 31 tall fescue will start to grow actively. There's a lot of us, we do it here on our farm, we call it novel endophyte tall fescue. It is, Kentucky 31 is a particular variety of tall fescue, and it has a fungus that lives within the plant's wall, or in between the cells in the plant, and it's mildly toxic. It's part of what makes it such a robust and competitive grass, but it's mildly toxic to our livestock. So we have novel endophyte tall fescues, which are just about as competitive, but they don't have those toxins within the plant, so our animals perform better on there. And another thing that you're starting to hear more and more of, they've become more affordable. Part of it is driven by the organic industry, is cover crops. 10 years ago, it was really hard to buy cover crops because there wasn't enough demand. So if you wanted to use any kind of a cover crop, it was hard to find. The organic people use them for weed suppression, but it's basically a plant that's usually planted in the fall to just keep the ground covered over the winter. There's quite a few different species. A lot of times we'll use small grains. What we do on our farm is we'll just go down to the co-op and buy whatever, if wheat's the cheapest, we'll buy wheat and we'll plant that. And then in spring, you have a lot of options with it. You can harvest it as grain, you can harvest it as silage, you can chemically burn it down with Roundup, and you can mechanically kill it. So you've kept the ground covered, you've kept that soil in place, you've suppressed the weeds. And so when you come in the spring to plant your cash crops, that ground is pretty clear. They tend to break down quickly. And so cover crops are not technically a forage, but you'll hear them about cover crops a lot of times in your forage conversations. And sometimes people use them interchangeably, and sometimes they are because a lot of people do graze down their cover crops. So I'm going to change lanes a little bit here. And no matter what you're doing, if you're, and I presume most people here, I mean, in Virginia, you definitely want to be in the forage business. That is the easiest, cheapest, most humane way to feed an animal. But animal welfare should always, always, always be your number one priority. And the reason I bring that up is because the second part, our goals and practices don't always match up. People will think they're going to go into the grass-fed beef business and they're just going to feed forage. They're not going to feed concentrate to their animals. And a lot of animals have really, they suffer because of those beliefs. We have these goals. We say we're not going to use, man-made fertilizers, and we say we're not going to use chemical fly controls, and we're not going to use dewormers. It's really, it can be an animal welfare issue, and those ideals they're worthy, but you can't say, I'm not going to use dewormer on my animals, or I'm not going to use fly tags or fly spray because I don't want to use chemicals on my animals. When your cows are suffering from flies. So it's just one of the things, and every one of us that's in the livestock business, I think, kind of, we're trying to balance that. What are our goals, and what do we have to do to make sure our animals have the best care we can give them? And it's not always real clear and real straightforward. That always has to be our goal. We always have to make sure that their well-being is our number one priority. And so, and then it comes back to the forage thing. If the forage is like the perfect food for livestock, that's what they're made to eat. So why don't we just feed them all grass all the time? How come that doesn't work? And then then it comes down to the thing, well, how many calories does that animal need? And can we adequately provide it? And sometimes we can't. Some seasons of the year, it's hard to do. Different animals in different growth stages. Growing animals need a lot more energy than an older, mature animal. So sometimes we do want to consider feeding concentrate or feeding corn silage or something like that to our growing animals. The season makes a difference, because of the weather and stuff. This works for horses and cattle, but the body condition score, 3, let's see, one is starving to death, and 9, I think, is the highest, is morbidly obese. It's 8 or 9. When we look at our animals and we say, okay, is this animal thin or is this animal fat? Well, if right now we have some cows that are probably a BCS 7, they're terribly fat. That's okay in September. If you have a cow that's a BCS 3, she's very thin. She's getting just adequate nutrition. If you have a cow in this time of year and she's thin, she's probably not going to make it through the winter. So you need to consider not only just what do your animals look like, but what's coming up for that animal. If you have a cow that's super fat in March, you've probably lost money on that animal somehow. She's been overfed. So you kind of have to not just look at the animal, you have to look at the season that animal is, the lactation stage. That'll pull a cow down really fast. You'll see cows that have just calved and they'll look pretty rough, but they're just producing a lot of milk. Parasites, flies will bring the weight off an animal. Cows can lose a lot of weight stomping flies. They won't go out and graze in certain areas trying to avoid flies. So we really need to be wary about parasites. Are we controlling flies? I go berserk if there's one fly in the house. I can't stand it. And then I go outside and there's flies on the cows. It drives me nuts. Internal parasites, especially if you have small ruminants, is really critical. It's not quite as critical with cattle, but small ruminants really can suffer from parasite infestations. And then temperature extremes, is it windy? Is it cold? That's all going to affect how many calories your animal needs. And then you've got to provide it. So this is kind of where it's kind of a lane change here, but our grazing infrastructure is what brings all that together. So where are you physically? Where do you live in relation to your animals? And where are your animals? Are they on your farm? Are they on a rental farm? Is somebody else watching them? And where's your feed? Because a lot of times they'll be in 3 different places. So you're always trying to balance that, especially when you're a beginning farmer, because you're probably talking about some rented land. You may not have adequate storage for hay where you live or where your animals live. You may be farming on the weekends and somebody else may be watching your animals during the week. So there's a lot of the grazing infrastructure is really the tricky part of this whole thing and how we bring this all together. So the first thing that you'll hear about is it pasture ground or is it hay ground? And then there's the thing, do we own it or do we rent it? Those are the kind of the big drivers a lot of times between that tell us what we can do with our forage and what we can do with our animals. So if it's pasture ground, it has water, it has fencing, there's shelter. Cows don't need quite as much shelter. They like to have a windbreak. Here in Virginia, we don't really think that much about providing shelter for our cows, but they're happier if they have a windbreak. Shade. We want to have vehicle access. You want to be able to get in and out safely. If you have rental land, or if you're looking to buy land, those are all critical things. Neighborhood dogs, subdivisions, it's really terrible, especially if you have small ruminants. I think pretty much anybody that has small ruminants have heard horror stories about their neighbors, friendly dog that came over and killed lambs. It's pretty common. Excessive noise. Those are the kind of things that will make a piece of ground not conducive to raising livestock on. Busy roads, that's something else. If you're near a highway, you may want to reconsider where you put your livestock. You may want to try to see if you can find something else to do that. Having adequate working facilities, especially if you have cattle, is really a big deal. Even something as simple as a cow that has a piece of twine around her foot, if you can't get her up to get that piece of twine off her foot, it can cause problems. We had a rental farm. It was roughly 500 acres, and there was working facilities in the middle, but if there was a problem, you basically couldn't get the cows there because of the way the farm was laid out. So having adequate working facilities and having a way to get to them, because if your working facilities are in the middle of an open field, it's going to be really hard to get a sick cow down there. And you want to have facilities to load in and out. You want to be able to get your animals in and out there without having to deal with traffic, gates that are not working, fences that are falling apart when you're trying to get animals in and out, on and off a farm. So then we get back to the winter feeding. We talked a little bit about stockpile. That's where you take your Kentucky 31 and you ration it out. You give the cattle, we call it rotational grazing. You give your cattle a break every day or however many days, and you get as far into the winter as you can with that. Usually you can get most of the way. Some winters you can get just about all the way through the winter without feeding hay, depending on your livestock and your pastures. Hay is easy to feed in a way. You don't have to worry about it so much. You have the quality issues when you're buying hay, but there's always transportation costs or storage losses, feed losses. Square bales versus round bales, that's a whole handling thing. If you are working a day job, you're coming home, you're feeding round bales and the tractor won't start, it's a disaster. Square bales are expensive and they're hard to deal with, but just about anybody can feed a square bale. So we keep a lot of square bales handy just for those times that, maybe you've got a cow brought up because she's sick or something like this. But round bales, that's pretty much what you buy if you're feeding cattle. A lot of horse people will feed round bales because it does keep your horses entertained. But if it's 5 o'clock on a cold Thursday night and you got to feed. You just can't tell those animals to wait later. You will hear about cattle quality hay and horse quality hay, and it makes me stabby because cows need decent hay, horses need decent hay. You can take some of these lower quality bales and it's good for them to have something to play with or lay down on, but we want to make sure that when we're going to the effort to haul and buy and store and feed out hay, we want to make sure we're feeding quality hay. And that's not always easy to do because it's hard. I mean, everybody here probably knows it can be hard to find quality hay. So with all of that said, this is the time of year we're normally stockpiling right now. If you're going to fertilize your fall pastures, you probably should have done that about a month ago. But on our farm, we're going to be doing that this weekend. We are we are bush hogging, and we are planting this weekend. And the most of those grasses will have a chance to come on, and we'll probably get some grazing. Some of our pasture, our winter pastures have already been bush hogged, but we have a few that haven't. And so between that and the planting, we'll be busy this week. Your best sources of information, I think, are your livestock conferences. Virginia Forage and Grassland Council has their winter conference series. I don't think we're having it this year. I have not heard officially, but I'm pretty sure that we are not having it. We normally have it the beginning of January. And then the American Forage and Grassland Council, they're having their annual conference in Savannah. And as far as I know, that one is still on. I don't know if any of y'all know Carl Stafford. He is the extension agent in Culpeper County. He is also the president of the American Forage and Grassland Council. So Virginia always has a big contingent, and Virginians tend to be pretty active within the American Forage and Grassland Council. Thank you, Michelle. So, and there's a lot of resources out there. Universities don't always, they have good information. They don't always have the best ways to share it, but Virginia Tech is where I always start. Virginia Tech also has a program, Grace 300, and that's part of this, I don't want to say push, but it gives producers kind of guidance on making sure that they can feed their animals 300 days a year, and they don't need to, to minimize the hay feeding. There's all these other VFGC, the Virginia Forage and Grassland Council. The Alliance for Grassland Renewal is kind of a new group. It's a consortium. They are cattle grazers, typically, some small ruminant people, and game land bird enthusiasts to try to, it sounds like there's buffaloes in my kitchen, to promote species of grasses that are wildlife friendly. And then, there was another group that is, oh, well, I had another group on there. It's a new, group. I have a dog upstairs. I don't have a dog. To promote wildlife grasses. And so all these other groups are on here, and you can see those as well. A couple of the publications that I recommend, there's a book called Southern Forages. It's $82 on Amazon, but I just found out this evening that Virginian Forage and Grassland Council has it for $45. It's a great reference book. If no matter what type of animals you're raising, it has just strategies for planting and maintaining your pastures. And then we had the Virginia Grazing calendar that comes out, I think it comes out in January. It's a partnership with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation and the Virginia Forage and Grassland Council. Chesapeake Bay Foundation is an environmental group, but they work a lot with producers to help them maintain their pastures, which in turn helps maintain waterways. So there's a lot of resources out there. We're not necessarily as good as some industry groups about pooling our resources and conveying them to the public maybe as well as we should, but there's a lot of information out there, and either Sarah and I can help you with getting in touch with somebody that can maybe offer some guidance or get you to some of these conferences. So Sarah, back to you. How'd I do on time?
Only 6 minutes over, Patty. That's pretty good. So
there's a big dog in my kitchen, and my daughter has a puppy, but there's a big dog I can hear up in my kitchen. Oh wow.
You have a visitor you didn't know about. So does anybody have any questions for Patty at this point, or any thoughts or anything they want to share with the group? Now is the time to do so.
Get a rundown of what everybody's what their livestock is, and what if they have pastures and if they're grazing and where they are in their in this process.
Yeah, whoever wants to start, please feel free to share.
Patty, this is Linda
Hi,
Eline,
Linda.
and I have dairy cows here, Dutch belted dairy cows.
Ooh.
And yes, I'm very, very proud of them. I sold the little bull calf when he was 3 weeks old as a herd sire. He's going to stay in Virginia. I hope to breed back to him some days. Just a little butterball when he left here.
Love it.
2 months old, just a butterball. But I ran into, actually, they all went on a little walkabout a few days ago. And I ran into my neighbor who helped me get them back. He was discussing a purple bloom flower that is toxic. And I have something in my, actually on my lawn because I don't mow it. And it smells a little bit like anise or licorice. The leaf does. There's a long purple, and he described it. I forgot the name of it, but he called it something weed.
And can you, Sarah? You're the crops person.
Yeah, not weed ID. I wish. No, I don't know off the top of my head. I'm not sure.
Okay.
Does it have a square stem?
I think it does.
It could be beefsteak then. If it's got a square stem, it's in the mint family. Got a mostly purplish leaf and gets kind of a purple flower on the top.
Right. He said it was in the mint.
Okay. Perilla mint.
Perilla,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some people call it beefsteak. I've heard either way.
I've never heard it called beefsteak, so I'm writing that down.
And what he said, basically, one of his cows has died within 2 days. He bush hogged a field, and apparently it was all over. It's near the chicken pen, and the sheep aren't touching it. The 2 ewes I have aren't touching it. And the flower or the leaf smells a little bit like anise. And then when he described it, I thought, oh dear, I've got that in the front, away from the cattle. But he said he let some cattle into a pasture that was covered with it, that he had just bush hogged, and they just basically went crazy, almost like a local weed.
Wow, that might be perilla mint. I have a neighbor who we think that's what happened to her cattle. I don't know that we have it on our farm. If we do, it hasn't been a problem. But a lot of those types of plants will, they're fine until they're stressed, either when we mow them or when they get like heat stressed or drought stressed. A lot of times they'll enact that, defense mechanism. I don't know if perilla mint is always toxic, or a lot of time, we have Jimson weed all over the place, but it's something that our animals don't touch. So I don't really know, but I can find out a little bit more on that. And I do have some weed ID web pages and stuff that might help. And I have a lot of weed ID books.
Yeah, so perilla mint is pretty nasty stuff. So basically what it is we don't see a problem with it until a drought year, because cattle, it's not one of the first things that they go to eat. So they won't touch it, but as soon as you bush hog it, it becomes more palatable for them to eat, and then they eat it, and yes, it's very toxic. You do have to use a chemical spray normally to get rid of it if you have it. Okay. Anybody else? Anybody else want to talk about what they're doing on their farm and how they're using forages, or how they would like to use forages more efficiently on their farm?
Yeah, I can go next. So we do 6 feeder pigs a year. We're trying to do on pasture and working on doing some seeding to improve that. And then we also have 3 Nigerian dwarf goats, kind of as weed control and pasture management, and they're in with 2 miniature Hereford Angus crosses. And we've got a pretty good fescue and clover pasture for them. We're only on 4 acres total, so we try to keep the
This is Scott in Louisa. I got about 25 acres. I got cattle, and I'm just trying to rotate pastures. I did have one field that I cut hay on 3 times actually, and just rotated the cows to that hay field this week because the grass came back so well. So I'm just trying to rotate them around as best I can. And then obviously once it gets cold, I'll have to feed hay, and I should have plenty of hay this year. So I'm just trying to learn what I can do to, you know, control the weeds and then to build a better stockpile in the pastures. So thank you.
If we have extra time, Patty, could you talk a little bit about silviculture?
Yes, I can.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Should I start on silvopasture and silviculture?
Silviculture, yes.
All right. Silviculture and silvopasture are kind of, they're really also very old things, kind of like the savanna effect, where you have a few trees in a grassland. There are, we have a silvopasture project going on right now on our farm. We're just going to it's a piece of ground that was timbered, and we just let certain oaks and different varieties of trees come back. There are ways to do it that your woodland part is a little more managed and your pastures are a little bit more managed. So you can do them for, you can put pines in there so you can harvest those pines as timber, but underneath those pines you have pasture, and you have mainly you're providing shade for the cattle. You can do it with walnuts. People are doing it with walnuts and pecans, those kind of nuts to harvest and sell. They have a big one going on at the Shenandoah Research Station, and I can't remember what they ended up putting in there. I think they just put hardwoods in there. So it's kind of wide open. The idea is to, you know, have your livestock in there so that they can graze and have shelter. And if you have pigs, you know, they could go in there and glean walnuts or orchards, those kind of things. There's different philosophies on it. One of the things that I've heard with some of if you're harvesting food type things from the trees is GAP certification, which is what is that? Good agricultural practices. It's a food safety regulation. So you do run into that if you're harvesting nuts or fruit and you're letting your livestock around the base of those trees. I think, I'm not an orchard person, and Sarah could probably speak to that a little better, but there are food safety issues involved with that. I don't know of any groups that are actively promoting those kind of things. We started to, or we're considering doing some of the, it's called beef to bobs. It is where you integrate your pastures, or you manage your pastures for quail as well as for beef cattle. Quail apparently don't like trees, so we feel like we have to have shade for our cows, and then predators, particularly raccoons, I guess. There's a couple predator species that like trees, and they will go after your baby quail. So they discourage having trees in some of these programs that are for wildlife, but there's a lot of good reasons to have your cattle grazing around trees, or your livestock grazing around trees. Am I even touching close to what you're asking?
Well, and Patty, I can say too, so in November, I have Adam Downing, who is the district forestry agent. He's going to be on that in November to talk to this group about forestry farming. And so I'll make sure that he talks a little bit about silvopasture in his presentation, because I know that he has done some work with that. All right. Anybody else have any other questions, comments, things they want to chat about? Going once? Going twice?
If Patty or Sarah, I'm trying to increase I have this is a grass-fed dairy.
Linda, I think we lost you. Linda, it looks like you're muted.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Yes. And I'm going to work on a YouTube channel to post
Thank you.
both last month's presentation as well as this month's presentation as well. So, all right. Well, thank you all very much.